I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
The most important words of my life.
I'm here tonight.
I stand
before you today
to declare that I am a candidate
for President of the United States of America.
I am running
for President of the United States.
I officially announce my candidacy
for President of the United States.
I'm running for President.
I am officially running
for President of the United States.
From the University of Virginia Center for Politics, this is Sabato's Crystal Ball, America Votes.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our second issue of this video Crystal Ball in our webinar series, going all the way through the election and until the election's over, whenever that may be, whether it's in November of 2020 or January of 2021. We'll all find out together. We enjoyed our initial broadcast last week, and we are going to continue with this second one. Just so you know, we're taping this on Thursday morning of the Republican convention. We have seen and heard everything up to it, but not including President Trump's speech tonight. So we'll all watch that, and maybe it will change our evaluation of the Republican convention, or maybe it won't. And we'll also have some comments about the Democratic convention too. So to get us started, I want to turn this over to the Crystal Ball's managing editor and so many other things, Kyle Condit. Kyle, take it away.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks for tuning in today. It's Thursday, August 27th, and on Thursday morning. And I mean, who knows between now and when this posts at 2 p.m., what sort of crazy things might actually happen in the intervening time. These days, it's sort of like a fire hose of news. So just a few housekeeping items. If you're watching via YouTube, please just hit that subscribe button. Our channel is UVA CFP, and they'll keep you updated on our future programs. And again, we're going to be having this once a week. And we also are kind of slowly expanding the options to listen to the program via audio. It's now available on SoundCloud, and it'll be available on other podcast platforms in the coming weeks. And also, if you want to support the Center for Politics in this broadcast, just text USA Votes to 41444. That's USA Votes, one word, to 41444. So with that, let's talk about it. I'm going to start with a reader question from a former UVA student, Mason Montgomery, Larry. And the question is simply this. Kellyanne Conway quit to, quote, spend more time with her family. Is this the first time a political actor actually meant they wanted to spend more time with their family?
There's an A student right there. A little sarcasm. It's a good way to start out a program. And by the way, that was 41444. I just wanted to check that number. USA Votes 41444. Just wanted to make sure everybody got that. Good question. Here at the Center for Politics, we know and like Kellyanne Conway. I know most Democrats do not, but at least you like her husband, George Conway. So there's something in that family for everybody. I honestly do believe, knowing Kellyanne a bit, and she's participated in Center for Politics programs before, I do believe that she's being honest there. It's pretty obvious that the family is split politically. Now, that doesn't always mean anything for the marriage. I think in this case it might have, but they've done what's best for them and what's best for their children, and we all ought to salute them for that.
Before we talk about the RNC, which is ongoing, I thought maybe we could look back just a little bit on the DNC from last week. Larry, any reactions, and have you seen any sort of effect in the days following the Democratic convention?
Well, Kyle, the crystal ball, as you know, predicted there would be no bounce or not a very big bounce, and it would quickly fade. Well, at least according to the data that we have so far, there was no bounce. Now, why was there no bounce? Well, first of all, the Republican and Democratic conventions are not drawing huge audiences. And you say, well, my goodness, they're up in the 15, 16, 17, 19 million category, depending on the night. But let's keep in mind that probably, assuming people get to vote and assuming the votes are counted, and we shouldn't take anything for granted this year, there probably will be 150 million people voting. So this is a small segment of the electorate, and it tends to be the activists. There may be a few stray independents or people who haven't decided. I've never met one of them in the Trump case, but I'm sure there are a few of them out there. It's just a tiny group of activists. And basically, it's Democrats tuning in to cheer for their side for the Democratic convention and Republicans tuning in to cheer for their side during the Republican convention. So let's keep it in context. This isn't like the old days. It isn't like when I was growing up when you had only 3 networks. We didn't even have PBS then. The 3 networks all carried the convention pretty much gavel to gavel for both sides. And you had to watch. It was roadblocked. If you wanted to come home and watch television, we didn't have VCRs. We had radio. We could go to the movies. But if you were going to sit there and have your dinner or have a drink or whatever, you were going to watch the convention. Well, that's long gone. That's long gone. And there's so many other choices now for people to watch. The second reason why there wasn't any bounce for the Democrats is they've maxed out, at least in my view, and I think Kyle agrees with this, and Miles as well. Seems to me that with a Democrat in the low 50s, which he is generally speaking 8 or 9 points ahead of Donald Trump in the polling averages, if a Democrat is there, he's not going to go much further in the election, no matter what happens. You're not going to have landslides in a period of extreme polarization. Remember, Obama, under ideal conditions for a Democratic challenger, got a shade under 53% of the vote. That's about as good as anybody is going to do on the Democratic side, and maybe on the Republican too. Democrats tend to outpoll Republicans in the popular vote. Their problem is with the Electoral College vote. So we'll see what happens on the Republican side. We haven't had a chance to view the Trump speech that's going to be aired tonight. Maybe that will create some kind of balance, but I'd be willing to bet a decent sum of money, not a large sum, decent sum of money, that the Republican bounce will fade very quickly if there is a bounce at all. And the Republicans are not doing as well as the Democrats in audience. They're getting 2-3 million fewer people a night. What about you, Kyle? How do you view that?
Well, one thing about the bounce is that there really haven't been that many polls this week. I guess we would love it if the pollsters did, right before the convention, right before the conventions, right after the DNC, right after the RNC. But of course, that costs a lot of money, so it's easier for us to ask, but we're just, we're not actually paying for it. But one thing to keep in mind, I think, is, and so there have been some of the kind of weekly trackers, so like Ipsos, YouGov, Morning Consult, and they've had kind of Biden leads in sort of the high single digits, sort of what the numbers that Larry was just talking about, and they haven't really shown much change. But those polls also tend to be pretty steady. Some of the kind of the live caller national polls done by like CNN and NBC News, Wall Street Journal, ABC News, Washington Post, they sometimes will bounce around a little bit more. So it wouldn't surprise me if maybe after the RNC, Trump's numbers maybe get a little bit better if those polls come out. Sometimes what that can be is this sort of polling term called differential non-response, meaning that Republicans may be sort of more fired up after their own convention, and therefore they're likely to reply to polls. And so maybe Trump's position will look better, and then we sort of have to see if that actually is just a product of this non-response, or if things have actually changed. And, I think Biden would certainly, if nothing changes coming out of the conventions, Biden will feel good about that. If this gets to be more like a 3 or 4 point race, though, that's when you really start to look at it as more of kind of a genuine toss-up. So let's move to the RNC specifically, Larry.
Kyle, one thing. Ahead, sure. So let's interject one thing. Biden did get something out of that convention. Even though he'd been in the Senate since 1973 and he had been vice president for 8 years, he still didn't have a well-defined image with a lot of people. And I think the Democratic convention filled in a lot of blanks. Now, for an incumbent president, you're not going to have that particular phenomenon. There aren't a lot of blanks to fill in. And notice, none of the speakers, even in his own family, have told a lot of personal anecdotes, have given us a new side of Donald Trump. In fact, his wife, the First Lady, Melania Trump, said, "What you see is what you get." That was a summary of part of her speech. There's probably not a whole lot more to discover about Donald Trump. So I don't think Trump will benefit in that way as Biden did, having the profile filled out. And that matters politically. You want people to have a sense of the person they may vote for to be president and be in their living rooms and potentially on their iPhones every hour on the hour.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one thing that I thought, at least I would say, sort of speaking favorably about the RNC so far, is that there was a lot of buzz pre-convention that, they didn't have as much time to set it up, that there were some technological issues potentially. I think it's been pretty smooth. I mean, I think maybe the Democratic convention was a little more slickly produced, but then again, I don't know if that, I don't think that really even matters. And I don't think there was anything particularly wrong with the RNC production. Obviously this is the first time for both parties doing events like this. Was there anything about just sort of the production of, I don't know, both conventions that stood out to you negatively or positively, Larry?
Well, what surprised me is that they were able in a relatively short time to make very good use of the primetime hour that the networks gave, which is really what most people watched, except for the Uber activists, people like us who couldn't miss a minute. We don't want to go to the bathroom or cook dinner because we might actually miss something. But we're a tiny, tiny minority. If people watched at all, unless they were Uber activists, they watched one of the major networks for an hour. And that was it, or maybe even part of an hour. They watched the major feature of the night. They watched last night Mike Pence's speech or part of it. They certainly didn't watch a lot of the preliminaries. So, we need to remember that what really matters is that featured presentation. And I think all of them, so far at least, have gone very well for both parties. I don't think when the election's over, we're going to look back and say, boy, that night at Convention X made all the difference, or even a substantial amount of difference. They're both making their cases, and they're reminding people in their base what it is they stand for and why the election matters. If Trump is gaining any, I think he may be drawing back some of his own voters who've become alienated over the past 4 years, and particularly this year because of coronavirus and the economic decline and all the rest of it. So, I think it's gone fine. I just don't think that even if we continue virtual conventions, that it's going to be revolutionary. And conventions are still dinosaurs, whether they're virtual or real. They're from another era, and people are not going to focus for 4 days on each party. They're just not going to do it anymore. We live in a very busy time.
There was a funny tweet from a kind of a never Trump Republican pollster named Sarah Longwell, and she was talking about how she was doing these focus groups, talking to voters, and she had all these questions about the conventions, and then she started off by asking, "Hey, how many of you watching the conventions?" And like one person out of 10 or 12 said that they were actually watching. And these are undecided voters. And I think we also know, just from other political science study, that the people who are the most or likeliest to be undecided, to be independent, are generally the ones that pay the least amount of attention. So, the people who are really keyed in, whether it's, a Democrat sort of hate watching the Republican convention or vice versa for Republican Democrats, that's a pretty common thing. One little just sort of maybe historical note here, something that I think stood out to some people is that, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo spoke at the convention, from Jerusalem. And there were some people thinking, hey, is that some sort of violation of the Hatch Act? Is that unprecedented in the past? Larry, what do you think about that? How did that stand out to you? Was that odd to you that happened?
Very odd. I don't think the average viewer cared one way or the other, but I do care about the continuing deterioration of our norms and standards in politics and government. And let's be honest, this administration has dissolved many of our norms and standards, and they continue to do so. except for Franklin Roosevelt, who was in a wheelchair in 1940 and was kind of at a low ebb of energy at the time, giving his very brief acceptance address to the Democratic Convention, sitting in a radio booth constructed in the White House. There really has been no other case of what Trump has done. In fact, no case at all. That's a very different situation, that using the White House grounds as your backdrop. You don't have to pay for it. It's provided by the taxpayers. You are a temporary resident. You do not own the White House. You're a temporary resident. So there's Melania giving her speech, and she did pretty well with it. But should it have been in the White House Rose Garden? Should President Trump's speech tonight be from the White House? These are kind of disturbing questions. And Pompeo's speech from Jerusalem, I love the argument that, he wasn't a Secretary of State while he was speaking. He was a private citizen. But I think that would come as a surprise to every diplomat around the world, because just as a president does not and cannot abandon his office even for a minute, the Secretary of State can't either during the set term or whatever term he served. So, but there you go. And in the end, it's up to people. It's up to Americans, and they don't seem to care unless they're partisan Democrats. They don't seem to care.
I think it did strike some people as odd that it was, because cabinet members do speak at conventions. Obama forbid his cabinet members from speaking in the 2016 DNC, but several spoke at Obama's own second convention in 2012. I guess maybe it's a little bit different for someone involved specifically in foreign policy. Although, I was reminded, I think one of the more famous convention speeches of all time, Jeane Kirkpatrick. She was still the UN ambassador when she addressed the 1984 Republican National Convention, and was very critical of Democrats and for the something about, I can't remember the specific phrase, but apologizing for America or something.
San Francisco Democrats.
That's right. Yeah, right.
The Democrats were meeting in San Francisco, and of course, Nikki Haley in her speech quoted Jeane Kirkpatrick because Nikki Haley had been UN ambassador as well. So she used the Jeane Kirkpatrick example both for the lines, but also I think to make a point about, hey, this has been done before, and I'm not even the incumbent UN ambassador. But these things go over the heads of most people. And as I said, that was one of the earlier speeches. It could have been Cicero, and I don't think it would have made an impact. None of these people in either party has been Cicero. There have been memorable moments, certainly, but we're not looking at the kind of rhetoric that once stirred the soul in American politics.
Yeah, I totally agree. One thing that stood out to me too, final point on the conventions, is that I really thought both Kamala Harris and Mike Pence they were fine, but it sort of speaks to the vice presidential job that I didn't really find either of them to be particularly memorable in terms of their speeches. I don't know, Larry, maybe you disagree. But I was just thinking, watching Pence last night, it was fine,
No, it was okay. Both of them were okay. What I remember from them is Kamala Harris, of course, mentioned Joe Biden a lot more than she mentioned Kamala Harris. That's the way you do it. Last night, I think the most common word other than articles like a, and the in Pence's speech was Trump. Trump, 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 Trump. Trump was a verb. Trump was an adjective. Trump was an adverb. Not quite, but you get my point. And that's what they're supposed to do. It's a job that is tailor-made for sycophantic behavior. To be blunt about it, that's almost in the job description. It's not to criticize Pence or Harris. That's what they're now supposed to do. But, America, I don't know that Americans really pay that much attention to the speeches that VP candidates give, because they know these people are just functionaries. They're a function of the president or presidential candidate. There's nothing original in there.
Yeah, and also, other than the VP debates, this is probably, it's probably it that we're going to hear from the VP candidates. Unless something happens to the candidates themselves. So the RNC is not, I guess, nominally being held in Charlotte. They did have some official events there and had the roll call there with a small number of delegates. But this week in a Crystal Ball, we took a look at the state of North Carolina, and so I want to bring in our colleague, the third member of the team, Miles Coleman, who had a great piece today on North Carolina specifically. Miles is not a North Carolina native, although your family lives there now. And we also, one of the contributors to that piece also was Bennett Stillerman, who is a University of North Carolina student who interned with us over the summer. So, Jason, let's bring up the map of North Carolina. And Miles, can you just sort of tell us generally about the voting patterns in North Carolina and sort of maybe how they've changed over the years?
Yeah, so North Carolina is a state where, for Trump, it's a state that if he's losing North Carolina, he's probably already lost some other purple states that he would need to win, like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. But it's close enough that he really needs to pay attention to it for the Democrats. What pretty much got me into elections and politics is I'm originally from Louisiana. I talk about that a bit more, but I was raised in North Carolina, and I just remember 2008 being such a big year there. And Obama, of course, narrowly won North Carolina in 2008. And ever since then, the Democrats have been really wanting to replicate that. So both sides have really these incentives to go after North Carolina. And it was a big year there, but 2008 was also more, in terms of electoral coalitions, it was also very much a transitional year in North Carolina. Of course, Obama narrowly carried it. Obama won really by getting high levels of turnout from African Americans. He did very well in the suburbs as well, at least at the time. You contrast that at the same time, North Carolina has its gubernatorial elections in presidential years. And then Lieutenant Governor Bev Perdue, who came very much from this Eastern political dynasty in the state, was running against Pat McCrory, who was the mayor of Charlotte, who was seen as very much a reformer, a Republican. So basically what happened, while that top map is more of something we would see now, it reflects sort of the more, the Democrats will do well in the urban areas like Charlotte, et cetera. They also have, there's also a pretty big block of African Americans up in the kind of northeastern part of the state. But what Perdue did is she won with more of the traditional type of coalition that Democrats would usually get there, where it was more of an east-west divide. Perdue did very well, basically won almost every county east of, say, I-95. And Pat McCrory did very well out in the western part of the state. It wasn't enough to win, but it was that 2008 gubernatorial map, sort of on the bottom, was really the last really traditional map that the state has seen.
Yeah, and then the future being that just like in so many other states in the country, that it's just sort of this really sharp urban versus rural. Question for both Miles and Larry. So I think that in the grand scheme of things, I think both parties are focused on 6 swing states really in particular. So you've got Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, industrial north, and then you've got Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida in the Sun Belt. My general sense anyway has been that North Carolina is probably the hardest lift for the Democrats of those 6 states. Larry, do you agree with that?
Well, it's one of the hardest. It would be toward the bottom of the list, Michigan being the easiest. And then we could argue whether what's happening in Kenosha is having an effect on Wisconsin. If it is, it probably is in the Trump direction. But of course, Trump has been behind in Wisconsin this time around. So, it's tough to say, but I grew up right on the North Carolina border. Gratefully, I grew up in Virginia. As they always say, North Carolina likes to say about itself that it's a valley of humility between two mountains of conceit, meaning Virginia and South Carolina. Be that as it may, North Carolina has always been more rural and more deeply conservative, whether it was voting Democratic or Republican. And when I was growing up, it was heavily Democratic, but conservative Democratic, exactly what you would expect from that era. Now, Virginia was voting the same way, but they've evolved differently. And for years, people told us that the research triangle was going to grow to such an extent that it would dominate state politics along with other urban areas. And North Carolina would certainly precede Virginia in the Democratic direction. Wrong, completely wrong. And North Carolina, I don't think has moved that far in the Democratic direction. We'll see this November. If Biden wins by a substantial plurality, then North Carolina might well tip too. But if Biden is even tied in North Carolina, we can go to bed early. I mean, that's an immediate sign that the election is not going to be all that close. Would you agree with that, Miles? Do you think that that's fair to North Carolina?
Yeah. If I would definitely say if really Biden is close there, it's may have less to do with the state itself than the fact that, okay, if he's up there, he's probably winning all of these other states. So it would probably be part of an overall national tide. But one thing I touched on in the article as well is it seems there's been a lot of migration into North Carolina from other states, and that hasn't been uniformly good for the Democrats. It has been in areas like the Research Triangle, but if you look at kind of the coast of North Carolina, there's a stretch kind of running from Wilmington to maybe New Bern, sort of in the southeast. That's attracted a lot of wealthy older retirees, which have kind of nudged that area rightward. So you're getting lots of migration into the state, but that hasn't uniformly benefited the Democrats.
That's correct.
Miles, you had a great little note in the piece today about how what the town of Cary, which is a Raleigh suburb, containment area for relocated Yankees.
Yeah.
That was pretty funny. Miles, I know you got to go, so thanks for your article today, and thanks for joining us.
All right, sounds good. Thank you all.
Great job, Miles. Thank you.
So we're going to talk now about the Senate specifically, and so we're going to bring up a couple of maps, and I'll talk about the first one, then Larry can talk about the second one. So the first one that we're bringing up, and I know some people are listening via audio, so I'll just sort of describe it to you, is that, one just function of the Senate map every 2 years is just, what seats are being contested. You got a third of the map up every 2 years. And we're in a time period where basically one of the Senate classes, the one contested in 2018, is sort of very lopsidedly Democratic. And so the Democrats are just having to play a lot of defense. And that helps explain why they ended up losing a couple of net seats in 2018, even though it was otherwise pretty good electoral environment for them. But the other two Senate classes, including the one being contested this year, are very lopsidedly Republican. And so you've got 35 seats being contested, and 23 of them are already held by Republicans, 12 of them are Democrats. Two of these elections are special elections, so you've got a special election in Georgia as well as a regular election, and then also a special election in Arizona that is really one of the prime Democratic targets. Now, one good thing for the Republicans on this year's Senate map is that, yes, they're defending a lot of territory, and so they're sort of overexposed, but so many of the seats they're defending are in states that really aren't all that competitive anymore, like South Dakota, Arkansas, Louisiana, Wyoming, Idaho, et cetera. And so a lot of these seats are going to be easy to hold. And so with that, let's go to the other Senate map, which will show our actual Senate ratings. And so we've got 49 seats at least leaning to the Republicans, 48 at least leaning to the Democrats, 3 toss-ups. The current Senate is 53-47 Democratic. Larry, what are your sort of overall thoughts about the Senate and where we sort of see it right now?
Overall, I would say this: if Joe Biden wins by at least a few points, then the Senate is likely to go at least 50-50, which of course means Democratic control, since the new Vice President, Kamala Harris, would break the ties. If Biden wins by more, then it's possible that the Senate would be 51-52 seat Democratic majority. You're not going to get a massive majority, Democrats who are listening. I just don't think it's likely. You certainly can get a few above 50, which Democrats would be more than happy to accept. But, it's also possible that if Trump makes this a very close race or edges out Biden in the Electoral College, losing the popular vote by 2 or 3 points, as he did in 2016, then I think the Senate has a good chance of staying Republican, probably 51-49, something like that, or 50-50, with Pence breaking the ties. So it's not over. You don't put it to bed. We have the same thing every 4 years. People go too far at this time of the election cycle, particularly during the conventions, and they make declarations that they will regret later on. So and so is certain to win. It's over. No, it's not over. Loads of things can happen. Don't we know that from 2020? God, has there been a year recently, maybe 1968 is the last one, where so many things happened in the course of the year, in the pre-election months. So, let's keep an open mind about this. The 3 total toss-ups for us are Maine, Susan Collins seeking re-election against Sarah Gideon of the state legislature. Susan Collins is a survivor, but this is her toughest race, at least since she lost the governorship back in the 90s. This is a very tough race. And if the election were held today, she'd probably lose. The election isn't being held today, so we keep an open mind. North Carolina, again, we just talked about North Carolina, and the suggestion was that North Carolina, as usual, is going to be a tough state for the Democrats. Now, the Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, seems to be winning handily for his reelection battle. That might help the Democratic ticket. The Democratic Senate, the Senate seats held by a Republican, Tom Tillis, a freshman, and they toss out senators with great regularity in North Carolina. They have no hesitation about it. Tillis is behind former state Senator Cunningham. And, if the election were held today, I think Cunningham would win. But again, the election isn't being held today. Iowa, I'm told, is close to a dead tie. Now, you have to look at the overall map. If Trump is even competitive, he's going to carry Iowa, just as he'll probably carry Kyle's state of Ohio. But will he carry it by enough to make a difference in the Senate contest? Well, I think they'll go together. And I'll tell you who else believes that is the incumbent Senator Joni Ernst, because after hesitating for a while, she's gone all out for Donald Trump and spoke at the convention and is signing email messages pumping Trump. And so if Trump wins, she may well win too, probably will win. If Trump falters in Iowa, then the Democratic candidate, what's the first name? Greenfield. But what's the first name? Yeah, she's close. She's very close, and she's competitive. So, those are the 3 we consider to be unpredictable at the moment. Obviously, Alabama is very likely to go Republican because it's Alabama and because Trump will win 55, 60, 61, 62, whatever he wins. It'll be more than enough to defeat Doug Jones. Now, if Doug Jones is winning, then the Democrats are taking over the Senate. There are 2 seats, though, that clearly favor Democrats where there are incumbent Republicans. In Colorado, freshman Cory Gardner has tried to project a more moderate image, but in fact, he has a very pro-Trump voting record. He's a pleasant enough guy, but Colorado is going for Biden, and that should be enough to elect former Governor Hickenlooper as the Democratic nominee in the Senate there. And in Arizona, appointee Martha McSally, who lost the other Senate seat just 2 years ago, 2018, is well behind Mark Kelly, the astronaut and husband of Gabrielle Giffords, who was shot in that terrible assassination attempt a few years back. He's clearly leading McSally. He, in some polls at least, is ahead of Biden. Now, whether Biden can actually carry Arizona in the end, we'll see. But that's one of the few states where I could see a split result, with Trump winning it presidentially and Kelly winning the Senate seat. And Trump's in real trouble there. Biden might well become the first Democrat since Bill Clinton in 1996 to carry Arizona.
That is such an interesting point about how 2016, every state that had a Senate race voted the same way for Senate and for president. And yet on this particular Senate map, you do have some Republicans who appear to be doing a little bit worse than Trump in their states. You mentioned Arizona. McSally generally polls behind Trump. We pointed this out in the North Carolina piece today that Tom Tillis is not getting as high of a percentage of self-identified Republicans as Donald Trump is. And then in Iowa, where there's been some polling that suggested that Joni Ernst is maybe running slightly behind Trump, although not all the polling shows that. There was one that had, I think it was Monmouth, that had the races almost basically exactly the same. So the question is do you see a sort of a consolidation? And then does Trump carry those states and save those senators? Sort of remains to be seen. But Larry, I think you're right that if you're looking for a candidate for a state that might vote differently for president and Senate, Arizona might be a pretty good candidate for that.
Yes, and I should mention, Kyle, we need to mention before we get emails about it, and we get lots of emails, Montana is certainly competitive because Governor Steve Bullock is the Democratic nominee running against a freshman Republican, Steve Daines. But, in the end, Donald Trump is going to carry Montana easily, probably not by the 60% he got the last time, but even if it's mid-50s, that's a tough tide for Bullock to swim against. Now, he got reelected as governor while Trump was winning the first time. So it's possible, and if the drift in the country is toward the Democrats at the end of the campaign, that's a possible pickup for Democrats, but I wouldn't say it's likely. And the same is true in Georgia. We don't want to upset our dear friend Alan Abramowitz down there, who believes that the Democrats are going to win one of the Senate seats. I just doubt it, but we'll see. Strange things happen, and again, I'm not going to fall into the trap of making absolute declarations before we even see Labor Day.
One of the tricky things with Georgia for Democrats, I think, is the format of both of those elections, because Georgia still has a general election runoff. And in the special election, all the candidates, and there are a ton of candidates on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, they're all running together on the same ballot in the November election. And then there's going to be a runoff. And there's actually a world in which two Republicans might actually advance to the runoff. The appointed incumbent Kelly Loeffler and Representative Doug Collins. Now, Democrats are hoping that Raphael Warnock, a black minister, is able to get to the runoff and that his candidacy catches fire. But the other problem for Democrats is in the other race, in which it's Jon Ossoff versus the Republican incumbent David Perdue, because Ossoff has to get over 50 as well. There's a libertarian in that race. I could imagine a scenario where Perdue doesn't get to 50 or Ossoff doesn't get to 50 and there's a runoff. But the history of runoffs in Georgia has been that the more reliable votes to Republican votes. So we'll have to see, but it's possible that two Georgia races might go to runoffs, and those would actually happen a couple days after the opening of the new Congress. The runoff is scheduled for January 5th. New Congress opens on January 3rd. So there could actually be two vacant Senate seats and potentially competitive races in both of those states. And so we'll at least know there's going to be one runoff in the special and maybe in the other race too. A reader question, sort of looking at it, not from the perspective of how many seats could the Democrats gain, but more like what would the floor be for Democrats if they have a bad election? So Brad Van Arnhem asks, there's been much talk of Democrats gaining a Senate majority, but I thought I'd be a contrarian and ask what you feel the floor is for Democrats in the Senate. So they've got 47 seats right now. They're probably going to lose Alabama, which would cut them to 46. Really, the only other vulnerable Senate seat, I guess, is Michigan. But Trump apparently is not doing particularly well in Michigan. Of all the states he won in 2016, it seems like his weakest state. And Gary Peters, the Democratic incumbent there, is persistently leading John James, who is a good candidate, has raised a lot of money, ran in 2018. So I guess I would, but then again, I could imagine maybe the Republicans recovering in Arizona or Colorado, but not both. So maybe it's like 46, maybe like the worst case scenario is they lose one seat. Larry, do you have any thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's as bad as it could get for Democrats. And I think that's unlikely. But the gentleman was asking about an unlikely possibility. So we gave him the unlikely results of that unlikely possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're sort of both kind of getting at is that it's pretty easy to find a path to like 50 seats for the Democrats, and they would hope the VP would break the tie. It's harder to think about like 52, 53, 54, although there are some upset possibilities that we'll get to shortly. We did have another question from Fred Kameni, who sort of asked about this sort of 50-50 scenario, basically saying, would there be any chance in a 50-50 scenario of someone switching parties? Does anyone stand out in the current Senate that could cross the aisle to maybe give one side the majority?
Well, there's a lot of speculation about Mitt Romney. I don't believe it for a minute. Mitt Romney was the Republican presidential nominee in 2012. He was Republican governor of Massachusetts, now senator from Utah. I think that the people of Utah, and I've spent some time there over the years, the people of Utah are pretty tolerant about this because they like Mitt Romney and they've never really taken to Donald Trump. It says all you need to know when you realize Donald Trump didn't even get a majority of the vote in Utah in 2016, when Republican nominees normally get over 70%. So I don't think they will punish Mitt Romney for voting for that article of impeachment or questioning Trump. I think they actually think it's a useful function that he's performing. But if he switched parties, no. And people are saying, oh, well, that'll guarantee him a nomination. He won't have to worry about competing in the convention. Well, actually, now there's a way to get on the primary ballot without going through the convention. And Romney could win it that way if he had to. I guess he could run as an independent or a write-in, but he'd much prefer to be the Republican nominee. So this is kind of ridiculous speculation. And the same about Joe Manchin switching. He'd be the most likely Democrat, I would think. But he's not going to switch either at this point. He's cast his lot, and he's more conservative than most, but he may not run for re-election. So these are kind of wild scenarios. Yeah, they happen from time to time. It happened in 1994, made a difference in the Senate then, and there have been other circumstances, but I think it's unlikely. That's all we can say right now.
The one other person who maybe comes to mind for me is Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, just in the sense that she has kind of built her own kind of unique coalition up there. Of course, she lost the Republican primary in 2010 and then ended up winning in a write-in campaign. She had a great ad about, I think it was like a spelling bee or something, about how to spell Murkowski to write it on the ballot. And in 2016, she won kind of a strange three-way race. She also has voted against the Republicans on a few big picture votes in recent years. And I could imagine her, she's up for re-election in 2022. I could sort of imagine her maybe being an independent candidate who could win. But, she's also, she's voted with the Democrats on a few things, but I don't think that she's necessarily, super moderate on most things, and probably, is more comfortable in the Republican caucus than not. So,
or she could run as an independent, sit in the Republican caucus. Mitch McConnell would be perfectly happy with that.
That's right. Yeah, and of course the Democrats already have two technically independents in their caucus, Angus King of Maine and Bernie Sanders. A few questions I combined together. One from Paul Cantrell. Are you seeing any surprise we should be watching? Essentially races that weren't expected to be terribly competitive and now to be in play. And then Erasmus Gustav and Tanmay Gupta. Tanmay is a crystal ball intern, specifically asked us about South Carolina. And another Trip Stanford asked us about Alaska, two sort of dark horse Republican states. Those are two that sort of come to my mind as maybe sleeper races. What do you think about those and maybe other sleepers, Larry?
That they are sleepers. Those would be the two that I would pick. We've heard a lot about Jamie Harrison, the Democratic candidate in South Carolina. And there have been some polls, public and private, that have him tied essentially with Lindsey Graham, who after all has made a lot of enemies. A lot of the Trump people still don't fully forgive him for the things he said about Trump in 2016. He called him a nut and a crazy and a whack job and all the other things. And then the Democrats and a lot of independents will never forgive him for being so supportive of Trump and being almost at times like a Trump puppet. So, he's got losses on both sides, but it's South Carolina. It's South Carolina. And Trump is going to carry it. Don't ask me what percentage. Probably matters for Lindsey Graham, but Graham is still the favorite, but it would not be a complete shock if there were an upset. And in Alaska, Alaska almost always ends up voting Republican after other polls may show it earlier in the season being leaning Democratic or being a little more Democratic. Now, the one race there I'm watching is in your tent there, Kyle, which is the House race. Don Young, the long-term incumbent in the House, one representative for all of Alaska. He says and does things that make his races competitive. I believe he only got 76% of the primary vote
That's right.
from the Republicans this year. That's not a good sign. That's not a good sign. Doesn't mean he's going to lose, but it means even though Alaska's pretty substantially Republican, you're going to watch that race. And tell them about the Senate race, Kyle.
Yeah, so Dan Sullivan's the first-term Republican incumbent. He beat Democratic Senator Mark Begich in 2014 in what ended up being a pretty close race. And the sort of quasi-Democratic nominee up there is a guy named Al Gross, who's a physician who is running as sort of a fusion independent Democratic candidate. It's kind of part of the reason I mentioned Murkowski as an independent, because the Democrats have started doing this thing in Alaska where they're nominating kind of sort of independents for their races, maybe as a way to sort of downplay the formal party title. At least Galvin, who's running against Don Young in the race that Larry mentioned for the at-large House seat, she also is sort of a fusion independent Democrat. And the politics up in Alaska are very fascinating in that, it's typically very, very Republican at the presidential level, although maybe not quite as Republican as you might think. But also the state has in the state House of Representatives, there's a Republican majority, but there are defectors from the Republican caucus. And so there's actually kind of an independent Democratic speaker of the House up there, even though the Democrats are in the minority. So a lot of kind of strange cross currents. And I would that's definitely a state that I would watch. As for South Carolina, and this is, I think, a kind of a useful lesson about how to read polls in that there are a lot of polls that will come out that show maybe Lindsey Graham 45, Jamie Harrison 44, something like that. But then if you kind of look under the hood, you see that Graham's got more room to grow because there are more undecided Republican voters. Now, Harrison's theory of the election is basically that Graham is so disliked in certain parts of the state, particularly kind of upstate, a little bit kind of Appalachian parts of South Carolina, and like Greenville and other places in the northwest corner of South Carolina, that some of those folks are going to be 1,000% for Trump, but they'll maybe vote third party for Senate, and that Harrison could maybe squeak by with 46 or 47% of the vote, with Graham bleeding votes to third party candidates. And so I do think that one's pretty interesting, but like Larry said, I kind of struggle with seeing a Democrat getting elected in South Carolina. But that is, it's obviously one that people care a lot about because Graham is so famous. Kentucky's kind of the same way, although Kentucky's an even more Republican state than South Carolina is.
Yeah, we go through that every 6 years too, with
right.
People writing us by the boatload, telling us Mitch McConnell's going to lose, and he always wins handily. But every year is different. We'll take a look at it. We've run out of time, obviously, for the second edition here of our Crystal Ball webinar. And we hope you'll join us next week, next Thursday, or whenever you choose to listen to the podcast or watch us on YouTube. By next week, I think there's a good chance we'll have at least some reading on whether the Democratic and Republican conventions have changed anything substantial in the race. I'm going to doubt it in advance, but I'm always open to being proven wrong by the data as it comes out from pollsters and by other means. So thanks for being with us. Kyle, you can say goodbye.
Thanks a lot. Just two quick things. If you want to support us, text USA Votes to 41444 and subscribe to our YouTube channel, UVA CFP. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Have a good one.